Welcome to the Kratom Advocacy Podcast. My name is Lawrence, and today we are speaking with Soren Shade. When I first met Soren, not formally, but we were kind of in a meeting, I knew almost immediately that, if not already, he would become a very important figure in the Kratom sphere. I've seen him speak with authority and knowledge on politics, on chemistry, different companies, and I was really impressed, and I really wanted to speak with Soren further. So without further ado, here is Soren Shade. Soren, you have such a storied and accomplished background for someone who is so young. Can you tell me how that all transpired?
Well, that's a very generous intro. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, I mean, I'm deeply interested in the subject. Broadly speaking, drugs and anything that it intersects sex with. I'm very interested in that. And I've found early on that I wasn't able to sort of feign interest in topics and do well. I just couldn't. I'm not the type of person to be able to memorize things because I was told to. But whenever I am interested in a subject, I can like read it once and it sticks for a long time, and I'm able to interconnect all of the data that has interested me and use it going forward in conversations, in writing, in business building, in bringing people together. It's something that comes easy to me in specific niches, and the drug world is the one that for some reason has struck me.
Is there a particular, is that because you have a personal affinity? I mean, I'm not shy. I'll say that I got interested in pharmacology because I wanted to know what I was taking. Was it the same case with you? And if so, what would your misadventures look like?
Yeah, so I was actually annoyingly sober for my formative years. And I sort of back-ended my way into drugs by way of philosophy and an interest in consciousness. And I know that sounds probably pretty pretentious, but I was born into it. I'm named after Soren Kierkegaard, the
Fear and
Christian
trembling.
yeah, the Christian existentialist. And my father, obviously, given that he named me after philosopher, was deeply into philosophy. So I kind of grew up in this sort of secular but deeply questioning philosophical community and family. And I was raised in a cafe, in a pub environment where conversations and coffee were like the currency. So I have always been interested in having deep conversations. And whenever I ended up going to school, to college, and ended up studying philosophy, I struggled a lot. It felt very sort of memorization focused. It felt kind of like uh, a game of egos, like who can make the most convoluted sentence wins. And I was very depressed, and I think I was largely in part due to pharmacological ignorance, where I was essentially aware of one stimulant. I was taking caffeine in excess, and as a result of that, I was having very little sleep or disturbed sleep, and that was because I was trying to stimulate my way into success in an academic level. And by way of my depression and some weird socially, hmm, what's a good way of putting this? I felt and saw drugs as inherently a self-destructive act at that time. I think largely because of the way that culture has placed drugs in the United States in the 21st century. Certainly not all cultures throughout history have seen drugs as a self-destructive act. I would say that's actually probably, we're in a weird time to see it that way. It's, drugs, drug is a medieval French inquisitor term for a commodity that has no value. So even the term drug, has a lot of latent negative connotations. In other times, the place it was seen as a medicine, which is a healing and self-improving um, experience. But I saw it as self-destructive, and so I self-destructive. And so in my depression and during my sophomore year of college, I thought, acid is a bad, horrible drug. I'm gonna do that, and I'll really have like a solid plea for help or whatever the hell it was. I wasn't thinking straight, but I took it, and I just like sat on this lawn, and just terms and definitions and philosophers and authors just made sense. And I was thinking, and I was looking at this
I know what you
tree,
mean.
and I was like, this is a shape of a tree. This is composed of wood and leaves, and this is position. And like, I know the, biologically, to an extent, what it is doing, what it is existing. This is the identity of this thing is so complex, and it's filled with so many pieces. And yet, whenever I look at this complex object, there's this association of tree. And that's where I had been like stuck in my classes. I just couldn't figure out what Williams James meant by associations in psychology. I'm like, a tree's a tree, and I'm looking at a tree, but I realized that it is an object that has no meaning until my collection and timeline of experiences come together to put language on top of this real world object. And suddenly, like, my interest in consciousness was reignited through that experience. And I was like, wow, this substance has really helped me understand philosophy and consciousness in a way that my tireless studies hadn't. And that was essentially like the catalyst for my obsession, is because I was like, I think I'm finally going to figure out consciousness, the nature of being, myself, by way of drugs. And that's a bit grandiose, and I don't have as high optimism for drug experiences anymore, but I think that they're extremely valuable tools that allow us to explore flavors of consciousness that would be otherwise inaccessible to the sober waking mind. And
why do you think it was you were depressed? Why do you think it was that you didn't bug out, or I didn't bug out? Yet I have a friend who, he was depressed and he did the same thing, and he just went south, even though he has no history of schizophrenia in his family. Could be genetic. But what was it? Something about your state of mind? You just have to really want it, or what?
I went in knowing so little about the compound, which is something that I do not recommend people do now. I'm obsessed with educating myself about drugs, and because I have that personal affinity, I tend to recommend other people learn as much as they can about substances before they consume them. On a bare minimum harm reduction practice of making sure that you're not going to contraindicate it with something else. Like, psychedelics and lithium tend to not play very well together. And if you're on lithium, especially if you have some sort of diagnosed mood disorder and you were prescribed that, you should not take psychedelics, especially LSD with lithium. And so just that bare level of understanding the compound can do a lot for ensuring that you have a good time and reduce harm and optimize enjoyment. Why I, in particular, reacted well to these substances, why other people do not, is something that I don't understand. There's these hypotheses that there are, young men in their early 20s, that's typically the time whenever if they're going to have some sort of psychotic episode or schizophrenic break or something. It's when it tends to happen. And it's usually precipitated by a stressful event. And these non-specific amplifiers that psychedelics and other drugs, not just psychedelics, but psychedelics specifically as like non-specific amplifiers, if you're in a stressful situation, it'll amplify that stress, and that is the catalyst, or at least the hypothesis of, you know, what induces these, what can make the break seem like it's associated with
So
that.
stress may be worse than depression for, okay, going in, maybe, yes.
Yeah, I mean, so you know, one of my annoyances in the drug world, or critique at large with people who write about drugs and talk about drugs, is this notion of pharmacological determinism, is that a drug at a specific dose will cause this effect for everyone, or even for yourself every single time. And that's simply not the case. I mean, some of them have, a lot of them have pretty determined physiological markers. Like if you smoke cannabis or consume THC, your heart rate will likely increase. That is a well documented physiological response. If you take something like a like an opioid, it'll dilate. I'm sorry, it'll constrict your iris. And if you take psychedelic, it'll dilate it. These physiological responses are pretty well documented. But in regards to, if you take MDMA, it will cure your PTSD every time. It's not true. If you take Zoloft, it will cure your depression every single time. That's not true. It's just there is a wide degree of experiences that can be felt from very similar drug experiences, even in similar set and setting. There's just a lot of unknown factors that go into determining what the end result of the drug experience is.
So you go from there, and then I see also, I was doing some research that you started, what was it, Top Tree?
Top tree herbs.
Okay, Top Tree Herbs. Yes, you started Top Tree Herbs when you were quite young. And how did you go about doing that at such a young age with basically no business? I mean, I'm being presumptuous, but with little experience. And you're still doing it today. You didn't fold, correct?
Did not fold, and there have certainly been a lot of opportunities to throw in the towel. So this is it's somewhat of a painful story, how Top Tree came about. I mean, it's a beautiful story, but it has some tragic elements to it. So I was finishing up probably the best job in my life, which was the job I had coming right out of college, which was being the producer for Hamilton's Pharmacopeia, which is a science documentary television series about psychoactive drugs with an
That's
emphasis on the chemistry. And as I was finishing that up, it was mid-COVID, and I personally, I grew up without a television. I don't watch much television, and so I didn't really want to stay in the production world. It just wasn't something that I was passionate about. It was the subject. It was obsessing over drugs and chemistry and pharmacology that made the job interesting for me, and getting to spend time with Hamilton Morris, who is just a wonderful dear friend of mine now, and who I consider to be a mentor. And as we finished that up, there was no promise of a season 4. Vice is now not really even in existence. They've, you know, declared bankruptcy and liquidated a lot of their assets and aren't really producing anything new. So there was no season 4. It was still COVID. Didn't know what I wanted to do, other than I wanted to stay in the realm of psychoactive substances. And I was called by a good friend of mine from that I had met at school, who had moved to Denver after we graduated. And while I was producing the show, he had started working with this cannabis remediation startup, where they took cannabis that had tested too high for aspergillus and other sorts of biological contaminants that made the consumption of cannabis unhealthy and dangerous. And their startup used ozone, O3, to clean the cannabis so that it would be able to pass the tests, and then it would be able to be turned into an extract or a concentrate or something like that. And he loved cannabis so much, which is why he decided to not take his like 6-figure job on Wall Street and go join a startup and drive trucks and eventually work his way up. And he called me and said, "Listen, man, you're the only friend I know who consumes kratom." I'm like, "Okay." And he's like, "I've got an idea for you. You know that kratom is consumed traditionally either as a chewed leaf or brewed into a tea." And it's like, "Yeah, I think I've read something about that." I hadn't really done a really deep dive in kratom at that stage in my life yet. I just had read enough to make myself comfortable to consume it and reduce my caffeine intake, which was extremely beneficial for me back in school. And then he said, "So knowing that this is the traditional route of consuming kratom, how many times have you brewed it into a tea and drunk it?" "Oh, never." Is that available? Do people make kratom tea?" He goes, "No." "So here's my idea for you." And
Ah,
so, yeah. And so Sam Weber was his name. And he said, I'm starting this tea business and I want you to come and help me with it. I want you to be a co-founder with me." And we were still at about 2 months left in the production of Pharmacopeia. And I said, "I'll think about it. But right now I'm working 80 to 100-hour weeks and I cannot be of help to anyone right now." I was like, "I think it's a cool idea. I love that you're pursuing it. It's very bold of you to leave your good paying job that you just recently got a promotion at to go start this. But, kudos to you, man. It's brave. And let's talk whenever I finish." And so that's exactly what we did. It was like November 2019, I finished up with Pharmacopeia and I left New York and came back to West Virginia, which is where I was born and raised, and started collaborating online with him. And then on New Year's Eve of 2019, 2020, I went to Denver and we just knocked it out. Like, we just put together a business plan, we put together our spreadsheets, we figured out what our cost of goods would have to be, what the 2-year, 3-year, 5-year plan would be, what our roles would be, and we said, let's do it. And we paid way too much money to have this co-packer on the East Coast make kratom tea bags for us, and we finally had product in hand. And this was all like our savings account, like that, from money that we had made from our one job out of college that we had barely pieced together. I mean, we were
at least you had one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, it was a good experience, our previous jobs going into it. And we self-funded, bootstrapped this startup. And in 2022, in August, Sam passed away. And it was
That's terrible.
yeah, it was
Wow.
a very tough time because the way we had split our roles in the business was, he was this type A personality who loved spreadsheets, and he had obsessed over this idea of turning himself into a millionaire through his own entrepreneurial initiative. And I was just like, I'm just like a nerd about this stuff. I just want to read about the latest science concerning psychedelics and kratom and cannabis and drugs at large, and pay attention to the policy. And the way he had really convinced me to come into the kratom space was like, kratom is a historical plant in the context of drug policy, and that in 2016 the DEA said, hey, we're going to make this illegal, and you guys got 30 days to whine about it before it's made illegal. And then, holy shit, the AKA and Susan Ash and Mac Haddow and that whole crew of people and the hundreds of thousands of kratom advocates and a bunch of scientists came together and did the impossible and rebuked the DEA. And it they created the template for a post-prohibitionist world in which these government organizations, which cannot self-justify themselves from a public health perspective, are beginning to face, the music, like the reality of the situation that we exist in, where the majority of people consume drugs and the majority of people have no issues with drugs, and it improves their lives. And it's an issue of freedom and liberty. And Kratom had drawn the blueprints for how to take something from being scheduled to be made illegal or something that was illegal and bring it back above board and maintain safe access for people. And ever since 2016, the fight wasn't over. There was still a bunch of local bans, state bans. And he's like, and your job is going to be, keeping up on that. Because I know that you will obsess over that. You will go to all the state capitals and you'll be able to speak on the science and why kratom shouldn't be prohibited. And I'm going to be, and which will double as like marketing for the business. And I will churn out the profit and the capital through the business to be able to fund these activist initiatives. And we will have a symbiotic relationship where Top Tree will become an anti-prohibitionist force, making a lovely tea product that people will benefit from and bringing people closer to the roots of the kratom tradition. And I love the idea. And then whenever he passed away in August, it was just like I'm not a business person. I don't like spreadsheets. I do spreadsheets. I begrudgingly
Begrudgingly,
compile.
yeah.
Yeah. But it's not my personality type. And it was a struggle. But after Sam passed away, my partner, my girlfriend, Caro, she stepped up big time. She had just moved to West Virginia with me. She had just left her vet tech job and said that she would help. And she is the type A personality Top Tree needed. She is so much of the brains and the organization behind Top Tree now. And I'm just kind of like a pretty face who tries to talk in all these meetings and make connections and help with marketing and do product development and some spreadsheets and all that. But Caro really stepped up in Sam's place because she believed in it, and she's the reason why we still exist and are a successful business today. I've desperately tried to hold everything together, but as a one-man show, this Top Tree can't do it. And now ostensibly it's two people running Top Tree with a handful of advisors who speak with us on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. So that's the story of Top Tree. And it's our mission now to just to prove Sam right. This was a good and viable idea. And, it's not, it wouldn't have made him a millionaire by 30, which is what his dream was. But, we have thousands of customers who love our product and say it makes their lives better. And that means a lot. That's a wonderful currency.
And he would have been happy with that.
I like to think so.
Cool. Continuing on in his memory, you're doing a good job. So it seems. Only 27, already running a company, and maybe you can give us some of the tips that you, things to avoid, I suppose, like things that you did wrong early that almost sunk you. What are some things new vendors should avoid doing that look tempting?
So we avoided, I think, a lot of the obvious answers to that, where we've never imported directly from Indonesia or Thailand. We've worked with vendors who we've established relationships with, who bring things into the United States as above board as you possibly can, given the import alerts, where they quarantine their crushed leaf kratom whenever it gets stateside for a month, and they do multiple samples of their batches and do lab testing, and they will do certain sterilization treatments to ensure that it passes those tests, and they throw away batches that are too high with the heavy metal counts, or utilize them for extracts, and they don't sell them to us. So, I think that's probably one of the most obvious answers is don't, try to do things, early on through your own channels coming from Southeast Asia, because it's almost impossible to do that GMP, which is what this industry needs. Is we need every business to follow GMP guidelines. There's no excuse. You have to do everything you can to ensure that your consumer is going to be able to consume your product without any worries for their health as a result of sloppiness on your part. And that's in a lot of ways what GMP ensures.
All right. And you mentioned extracts back there. Maybe you could talk about your business's position on extracts and isolates and 7-OH in general, and how it's kind of a hot topic right now.
It's a very hot topic. It's
That's all I
the
hear.
hottest of the topics in the kratom space. So I personally am not really against anyone consuming anything as long as they are aware of what they're consuming and, have done, within a rational, sober state of mind, done the, necessary amount of risk reward calculus that they need to do to satisfy themselves personally. So I have no problem with people consuming extracts. I have no problem with people becoming physically dependent upon extracts if that, bestows them a higher quality of life, because we're all dealing with our own shit. Like it's hard being a human, and there's a lot of difficulties that we face in this very tough life. And if you find something that makes life better for you, that doesn't result in harming anyone else, then I am not going to say anything to you other than congrats for getting this much closer to figuring out how to navigate this whole thing through your experiences and your personal life. So extracts are wonderful to some people. 7-hydroxymetragenine and metragenine pseudoindoxyl isolates have, based on anecdotal reports that people have written up online, which I assume are not all written by the companies that are trying to sell them, seem to have reported positive effects from it. The difficulty, this question of extracts and isolates and semi-synthetics and synthetics, comes from the political context and the social situation and the general prohibitionist culture that we live in, that we've consumed through popular media, that has predated pretty much every generation alive. The United States has had this very prohibitionist mindset for decades now. And so it's very hard not to be consumed in it. And so, of course, the vast majority of our legislators have this negative connotation towards the word drug and things that seem like drugs to them. And so we have to be very careful in how we tread and how we position the kratom space in the context of this irrationality that doesn't recognize, the science behind these substances and doesn't honor the principles of freedom and liberty that this country was built upon. And the crux of this debate around high potency extracts and semi-synthetic 7-hydroxy products, which is really the worry because it is considered to be one of the highest, it has probably the highest affinity for the opioid receptor of any of the alkaloids within the kratom product. And so that worries people because opioid is a very dirty word following the sensationalism around the so-called opioid epidemic, which is largely just a socioeconomic issue with a scapegoat called opioids generally. But that's a bigger topic for maybe a different conversation. But within this context, where we're essentially walking on broken glass, people don't want these products that put a bigger bullseye around the kratom space being on the market out of fear that it would result in greater damages to the industry at large. This is a tough question because it
For
in some
sure.
ways you have to go against this libertarian principle of giving people the freedom. But essentially it all boils down to is, even isolated metragenine and 7-hydroxy are not kratom. They are one thing. They are metragenine and they are 7-hydroxymetragenine. Caffeine is not green tea, is not coffee, is not yerba mate. It is a molecule. 99.9% pure caffeine is just caffeine. It doesn't matter where it came from. It doesn't matter if it's comes from a total synthesis of petrochemicals or if it was extracted from a plant. It's caffeine. It's going to do the exact same thing pharmacologically within one's body. And I think a lot of the issues around these extracts and 7-hydroxy products right now are really just rooted in a complaint / request that they don't call themselves kratom because they are materially different than kratom, and they should honestly label themselves as what they are and not try to trick the consumer into thinking that they're taking something that they're not, which is I think a fair ask. But unfortunately, where a lot of these products are coming from are people who don't really give a shit about the sustainability of the market or how it's going to affect the consumer. This is a very lucrative market from what I've been told, and they are looking to make money from it. And kratom is a well-known term that a lot of people love and are interested in trying different kratom products. And they see something on the market that's kratom that has a powerful effect. They go, oh, I like it. But it doesn't have the plethora of scientific, data surrounding its safety of use that kratom in its whole leaf product does. And metragenine is different because given that it is by weight, the most predominant active alkaloid in the kratom plant leaf, it has just been studied by nature of people saying all the effects of kratom come from metragenine. Therefore, we're just going to isolate metragenine, study that in animals. And so there's actually a pretty robust safety profile around the consumption of metragenine by way of people misunderstanding kratom and thinking kratom is nothing but metragenine, when, like Chris loves to say, it's actually the concert of these alkaloids together and how it all interacts. So, metragenine and kratom, with its variety of alkaloids acting in concert, have this degree of understanding around it, whereas 7-hydroxy, unfortunately, just doesn't yet because science is slow and it just hasn't fully studied that yet. And there are no human, safety trials on purified 7-hydroxy yet. I really hope that it is shown to be a really effective and safe compound, because I think that 7-hydroxy, if it does have this safety profile around it that the people who are marketing it are touting it, I think it could be a wonder drug of the future. I think if that was prescribed in 2008 instead of hydromorphine, like there would be so many less health issues associated with overconsumption of these semi-synthetic opiates. It seems like it has a greater degree of safety profile, and I really hope that someone does the science and that's what we end up finding out. But yeah.
Right. So also in the subtext of that is the debate. The California bill, for example, 1% or 2%. Matt Callow said on the last episode that limiting it to 1% total alkaloid content, I believe that's correct. That would stifle innovation and it would limit consumer choice. What do you say? What is your riposte to that?
I mean, it is a limiter built into the law meant to exclude certain products that at this time in history don't have the safety profile around them that Kratom products do. So, in a way, it is limiting those products. It's really unfortunate because all of this sort of argumentation could be avoided if the FDA just kind of stepped up and did its job in the first place, which is to require that companies provide adequate safety data before they introduce a product to the market. And because the FDA has abdicated that role, it's left to this self-regulatory processes within the industry and the lobbying efforts funded within the industry meant to ensure the sustainability of the market. And no one really has the hard and fast answer for what the perfect solution is. And I have sympathy for both sides of this debate at the moment, which is quickly turning into a yelling match. Um, and I have sympathies with Mac. Like I think pure 7-hydroxy products should be allowed on the market. I don't think they should be called Kratom, and I do think that they need to provide adequate basis for their safety before they are on the market. But I don't think that they should be banned de facto, just like that. And so I'm really torn in this debate. I do think within our current political situation and how delicate, the Kratom legal status is, that in an effort to reduce possible unexpected issues with the consumption of isolated 7-hydroxy products, that the best metric for determining whether or not a product has been modified or adulterated prior to hitting the market is to create this rather high bar of 2% that products cannot pass. Mac's idea that the synthetic clause does enough to ensure that these semi-synthetic 7-hydroxy isolates are not on the market is a wonderful, beautiful idea if we had an agency that would chase down these companies and follow their manufacturing process to see if they were actually extracting it, which they're almost certainly not, given the, just the teensy tiny amount of 7-hydroxy that is found in the plant material. And then pulling the products in the market that have been synthetically produced. Not that there's anything wrong with synthetically produced products. It's just that, again, that is a symptom or a sign that a product hasn't undergone the safety data yet because 7-hydroxy data is not there. I mean, it's a very complicated issue, and until there is something that measures carbon-14 in products to determine whether they're based from petrochemicals or a natural product in these state regulatory agencies that police the kratom industry, there's not going to be any way to determine if alkaloids are synthetic or semi-synthetically derived. And therefore, we just have to create some other clause that ensures that they're not saying that something that is not kratom can't say that it's kratom. I mean, that's essentially the crux of the arguments. Things that are not kratom should not say that they're kratom.
Okay, and you have been working with the GKC for a while on this. Can you explain how you guys first kind of teamed up and your story with them?
Yeah. So I've, full disclosure, I've also worked or collaborated with the AKA in the past, and have gone to in-person meetings and I think it's a wonderful group, which, again, has done something absolutely, just one of which should be a celebrated event in the drug community writ large, in the overturning of the DEA's attempt to schedule kratom in 2016. So, kudos to them. And this notion right now that the GKC and the AKA are somehow at war or competitors or have different goals in mind, I think is is an incorrect assessment of the situation based on the facts that I have at hand. I might be able to be convinced differently if something comes up that I was previously unaware of. But I was introduced to the GKC by way of New Brew, which is this new and emerging company based out of California, started by three brothers, and it is a kratom extract and kava extract flavored seltzer, and it's like almost microdoses of both of those products. It's a very mild drink, but it tastes good, and they've honestly, I was really initially attracted to them by how awesome their labels were, because that's one of the few things that I have legitimate critiques of everyone in the industry right now, except for like literally a handful of companies. Everyone needs to step up and be adults and have real labels on their products that accurately discloses what's in it and how much to consume. And
Some of it looks
that's
like Traphouse graffiti. When I go, it's like
it's a really unfortunate labeling situation we find ourselves in. But I'd been impressed by New Brew, and then was introduced to them through another company, Botanaway. They introduced me to them, and we had a lovely talk. And they were fans of Hamilton, and they had read the Top Tree blog as they were considering whether or not to leave the jobs that they had and do the startup life and create this kratom kava beverage. And so we had just kind of had a professional relationship, and they hit me up and said, hey, there's this organization. It's largely California based right now. And I think you would get along with them. You should join us for a call. And I think I was introduced to them that way, maybe by email. But then we were in Washington, D.C., a lot of the vendors for a federal KCPA lobbying event. And Matt Lowe, who is the director of the Global Kratom Coalition, was there, and we sat down at a Starbucks and had a coffee and talked about the coalition. And then I started attending the virtual meetings. I think that's the order of operation.
cool. Okay. And you mentioned your blog. Can you talk about the success you found with your blog? What kind of writing schedule you had, how you produced that content?
Yeah. So, I mean, initially, whenever we first started Top Tree, it's like we don't have money for marketing for anything other than, keeping the website running and building up our inventory. And so, what's the cheapest way to get eyes on the website that could potentially convert to customers? And that was through SEO and blog writing. And that was what I initially did, was essentially 2 blog posts a week for probably the first year. Sometimes it was just one, but that was essentially my entire focus, was trying to convert my depth of knowledge around kratom and chemistry and pharmacology and the way psychoactive substances play into different aspects of culture and society, and utilize SEO terms to get visibility on the site. And it was essentially just trying to lean into a skill that I had a little bit of in an otherwise having had no business skills whatsoever. So the blog was essentially just this SEO outlet that was able to write some things that felt original, because the kratom blog post space is really bad. It's mostly just people paying $5 to $10 to outsource SEO blog writing to firms in India, and they produce god awful content that almost always started with kratom is an opioid found in the leaf of the Mitragina speciosa tree. That was like the way every single article started. And it's like, first off, you can't have that on your website. You can't make the claim that kratom is an opioid, because that's a drug claim, and the FDA will shut down your whole website for that. And I have no idea how these websites, got away without getting a letter from the FDA. So we just, we're trying to play by the rules and get eyes on the website. And that was, the inception of the Better Brewing blog.
So why doesn't prohibition work? And does it work better in a democracy versus an oligarchy? Are we headed toward a society where prohibition would look different? I mean, obviously we are, but how? Just play with those ideas, I guess, and maybe start with telling me why it's an inefficient idea, and then we'll move from there, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, it works if you're part of the ruling class and you're doing everything you can to ensure that you stay in the ruling class, and those who are not in the ruling class stay out of it. Um, Everyone has a desire to alter their consciousness. I don't want to make an absolutist statement, but generally, most people at some point in their life desire to change their consciousness. And drugs are a very effective means of doing that. If you get tired of standing on your head or spinning around, for changing your consciousness, drugs are a very effective means for doing that. And so most people at some time in their life will consume drugs. And by way of that, you now have inroads to having complete and utter policing power over your populace. You have an excuse to barge into anyone's home. You have an excuse to pat anyone down. You create an environment of fear and reduced activity by prohibiting things that people love. You force people to go in the underground and stop acting out in the open, which is revolutions are done in the open, right? They're people coming together and talking and exchanging ideas and how can things get better and how can they improve. And if every time people get together, they're met with the policing arm of the state, who will lawfully be able to be violent towards you because of an excuse that you have a dangerous society corrupting substance on you, you're less liable to go out in the open. I mean, the Nixon aide in his 90s interview, Eiselman, it was one of the Nixon's aides, publicly
Yeah.
stated in a 90s interview that the reason that they made that they started the drug war was because they wanted to be able to turn hippies and black people into political they were political enemies, and they wanted to be able to rightfully throw them into jail or raid their houses and read their documents and surveil them. And so prohibition works very effectively for that. It also there's a lot of things that prohibition does. It's also a very effective scapegoat for social issues that maybe you don't want to deal with. I'm in West Virginia, which was the state that was most deeply affected by opioid-related overdoses for the past decade, if not more. And it's not because, you know, opioids are a new thing that were recently introduced that just immediately became just this popular sensation that everyone wanted to participate in and consume. So much of it has to do with the fact that all the good industry left, in the 70s and 80s, and their trade deals that are responsible for this capital flight and the job market restricting, that is directly traceable to political decisions that people have made. There's a failing educational system here. People are not, being taught what they need to know to go out and live a successful life in the 21st century, and how to provide for themselves. There's this, the cost of healthcare has gone up dramatically. And so if people do have, a little bit of money and they get a medical issue, they suddenly have no money and they're back in poverty. And there's just this constellation of causes for the poverty and despair in the area that are directly linked to specific decisions specific politicians have made that have come together to create the very complicated problem that is not being addressed and instead just being called an opioid epidemic. The issue is opioids. Stop there. You get rid of opioids and everything will be okay. And everything won't be okay if you get rid of opioids in the area. Opioids make people feel a little bit better. Opioids make people hurt less. There's a reason why people aren't feeling great and are hurting over here right now. And it's because what was once a thriving community with a robust social network has just been split and torn through this march of progress and the change of um, a global economy that no longer favors, factory-centric communities, which is what, the Rust Belt once was. And that's the area that was hit the worst by the opioid epidemic, which is it's just the scapegoating term of all scapegoats. In the 30s, it was reefer madness that caused poor people and immigrants to commit acts of, to commit violent crimes. And that's just a demographic that experiences more violence within it than other demographics. And it's because of cultural and economic issues that results in people becoming more violent. Victor Hugo wrote about this in Les Miserables, in the 1840s. It's a well-documented and understood fact of life that poverty is hard and it makes people hard. And that is where violence comes from. But no, it's you smoke the reefer and you can't help yourself but commit these violent, horrible acts. And maybe it makes people of color, want to go hang out with white women. And dear God, we can't have that. So we have to associate the thing that these people of color like doing with crime and make it illegal so we can throw them all away. And so I guess the sum of this little rant of prohibition is it's a very functional scapegoat for big issues that are hard to solve, that I don't have answers for, that I don't know if anyone has the complete answer for. So it's difficult to deal with these issues. And so they're just better set not dealing with it and instead creating some sensationalized magical monster out of various drugs. And it's just a different drug that's in fashion as the magical monster every decade. And you kind of forget about the one that came prior to it. So prohibition works for some people, and it really screws over the rest of us that like freedom.
Just a good scapegoat. So when you don't have the answer, just make up a convenient one. In 5 years, where do you want to be in your career? What's your next evolution phase?
I don't know if this is 5 years from now, but I
If we're
really
all alive.
want. Yeah. If I like to orient myself towards actions that maybe in some would work in some small way towards the repeal of the Controlled Substance Act. I think that what I'm doing right now is just this incredible educational experience of how people engage in discussion around tough topics, how to make the neoliberal political landscape that we live in work for us, meaning that we don't live in a democracy. The way you change laws is through lobbying. And so learning about lobbying and learning about making something that's popular and well-known among people through a product, through this education. And so all the lessons that I'm learning in this, I hope to someday employ in a more broad level towards ending prohibition. And I think the policy that's in place that props up prohibition, the Controlled Substance Act, and I would like to work in some small way towards repealing that. In 5 years from now, I just hope that I still have as passionate of an interest in the subject. But if I don't, I hope I'm pursuing the thing that I'm most passionate about. But I haven't really thought deeply about what exactly, each year in my future should consist of in order to reach the end goal of, repealing the Controlled Substance Act. I just want to just take lessons and be flexible as much as I can.
Well, I'd say that passion is definitely a facet of your personality. So wherever you go, it should be interesting.
It's very kind of you.
You're welcome. And you mentioned that you may have a question or two for me, so I'll do that now if you'd like.
Yes, I mean, I'm so interested in all the people in the kratom journalist space and the kratom advocacy space that have created platforms for themselves. I think probably the OG guy in the space was Brian Gallagher with the Kratom Science podcast. He's no longer producing content. We have Madeline Sklar now. We have Kratom Stories. And there are a number of other good podcasts out there that largely document and cover the kratom space. Brian was, hired by a vendor to create essentially an SEO catch-all. Madeline is a passionate advocate for kratom because she's a consumer who sees immense benefits from herself. And I'm interested in what your story is and why you decided to start the Kratom Advocacy podcast.
Well, the short answer is because I wanted to quit kratom. The long answer is I had been using it to get off of a pill addiction. I had gone to the dentist and I had really liked those pills. I spent a lot of days by the pool eating Haagen-Dazs and popping the hydrocodones. And it was great. But eventually I got to a point where it's like, oh, I have a kid and I'm being a piece of shit. And I found kratom. Just incidentally, I was hanging out with one of my buddies, and he passed me a couple kratom capsules, and he said, dude, like this is phenomenal for that as well. I've been reading about this and you can use this. There are agonist and antagonist effects to it, so you can't go too high. If you're looking for help on your way out, this is it for you. And he was right. I mean, it was phenomenal. It was almost too good to be true. Just a couple of days, I had no more cravings. And that went on for a few years. And I said to myself, thank you. I appreciate this journey I've been on, but I've not really gotten too involved with the community. And I want to still be, I don't want, it's been a part of my life for so long. Every day I wake up, and I didn't want to leave all that behind. And I love journalism. I always have loved talking to people. I wanted to minimize my ego with it too. I wanted to just let other people go and hear what they have to say. It's good practice for me shutting up because, I was raised in a house with, a bunch of eloquent women. And if you couldn't get your point in, you were just going to get railroaded. And I'm still using those skills today with my wife. So I guess that's how I got started.
That's deeply fascinating. Now I have a lot of questions for you. I don't know if you want to
go for it.
To answer it in this. I also have recently started a podcast called Tea and Other Drugs, and cool. I would love to have you on there and talk to you about that. Maybe a little cross promo.
Oh man, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's plan on that. But whenever you were consuming these pills, like you've described what is sort of the contemporary liberal explanation for the root of the opioid epidemic, is that people were prescribed these opioids, which were marketed by Mortimer Sackler, the head of the Purdue Empire, as a non-addictive pain treatment.
Interesting.
And so doctors were given liberal allowance for the prescription of this but for non-life-threatening illnesses. It's normally these high-potency opiates were reserved for end-of-life cancer treatment and things like that. But suddenly there became this much more liberal prescription of these substances to people who maybe didn't need them. And then people were addicted to them. And then doctors, either by way of the prescription running out, said, hey, you're not getting any more. Or there were policy changes which forced doctors to stop prescribing them. And then people had such strong physiological dependence upon them, and perhaps psychological dependence upon them, that they turned towards the black market and started consuming heroin or fentanyl or any of these unknown opioid agonists on the black market as a way of stopping themselves from getting sick. And you're very cursory description of their path from dental prescription to a self-described addiction kind of fits that model. That was very popular for a while. That was often touted in the New York Times and the Atlantic as the root of the opioid epidemic.
I
It made
wanted
things
it.
very.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Like when I look back on it, I said to myself, you have an addictive personality. You knew when you said, oh yeah, sure, it's fine. You didn't stand up for yourself. So I don't know. I don't really know. I say it's because I had a dental thing, but was I thinking to myself, I hope he gives me pills? Probably because my dad was a crackhead, my mom was a crackhead. My grandpa was an alcoholic. Grandma was the only one who kept it straight. So like I've been around, addiction a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in terms of alcoholism, that's been shown to have some sort of, genetic predisposition to become an alcoholic. And so, that, certainly something to be aware of whenever you begin taking substances which have associations of addiction around them. But stepping back to kind of get a better sense of what you're saying, could you kind of like give me your working definition of addiction and the meaning behind that when you say that you were addicted or that you had an addictive personality?
I'll do my best. You said something earlier to me that really is still ringing in my head. You said, what was it? Pharmacological determinism. Was that it? The idea that taking this substance will have the same effect every time. And I tangentially related that to addiction in the moment in my head, but I didn't really get back to it until now. I kept thinking to myself, I need this to go out because if I take it, I'm going to be relaxed. I need this to do that because if I take it, I'm going to be eloquent. I need this to take it because I'm going to enjoy, sex more or whatever. I can't do it alone. I can't hang with my friends. When I suppose this is very unscientific, but when I need it to achieve a certain state of mind that should be accessible to me normally, it's not a very exact answer, but for a personal definition, that's always been my marker. That's when I know that it's happened a few times to me. That's when I know that I'm in.
Yeah, that's a solid response. Stanton Peele, who is a prominent theorist on addiction, he wrote a very popular book in the 70s called Love and Addiction, where he made the connection between actions in romantic relationships with addictive drug relationships. And one of the things that he said that led to the souring of romantic relationships is expecting a person to remain constant and never change, and have that person make you feel the same way every single time that you went to them. I love my girlfriend because she builds me up when I'm feeling down. She puts a smile on my face and knows exactly what to say. And 2 years into the relationship, maybe she's having a bad day. I come home and she doesn't put a smile on my face. She doesn't pick me up when I'm feeling down. She's down herself. Maybe she's just busy and she doesn't have time to, be focused on me 100% and no one else. And then lo and behold, my, Pavlovian response of if see girlfriend, then feel good is torn. And that's, that relationship starts to get, it's really tried. It's becomes stressed, and then I will start behaving strangely, oddly, poorly in a way to try to coax those same feelings out of her again. I love her because she makes me feel better. She needs to continue doing that. She needs to be the same, affirming person every single time I interact with her. And I give her no flexibility to grow, to evolve, to change as a person. And that is sort of, one of the features of a bad relationship, of a failing romantic relationship, when you insist on someone stay the same every time. And I think that is a lot of the issues with with drug use, and whenever something go from being beneficial to your life to detrimental to your life. I love smoking weed, man.
Oh yeah,
Like
me too. Weed's amazing.
yeah. And if I expect, weed to create these wonderful philosophical monologues in my mind that I can just sit back and just be so happy that I am getting to just be a witness of this inner philosophical grandeur
You
that I
changed my
have
life with this
created.
idea, man.
Yeah. And if suddenly, I'm smoking a joint one evening and I'm smoking it, my heart rate goes up a little bit, my eyes get a little red, but nothing's sparking, man. Nothing's going on. You know what? I'll just roll another one. I'll smoke another one. Hey, maybe that'll get me there. Maybe that's okay. Hey, maybe it got me there. And then, a month from now, 2 months from now, I'm smoking tons and tons of joints. Going like, man, why? Where is this brilliance? Why is this not getting through my writing block? And it's this inability to accept that all things change. Interpersonal romantic relationships, they will change, and you have to be willing to, be flexible with it. And drug relationships and the effect that a drug will have on you will not remain the same every single time you use it for decades on end. It will change. And if it begins to change and it doesn't take away your social anxiety before that big party, hey, maybe it's time to take another. Oh, I've got to reduce my consumption time from every 4 hours to every 3 hours in order to get rid of that social, anxiety. Or maybe just something changes in you and it just no longer does that same thing. And yet you continue to push that button over and over again because of the memory of the pleasure or the effect that it gave you one time in the past, but it no longer does that. That's whenever it can get self-destructive and repetitive and mindless and become bad, is this understanding that it is like literally everything else in life, is it will change, and you have to be flexible and aware of how it affects you on that specific instance and not how it's going to affect you always. So that's kind of like my conceptualization of addiction and how I try to avoid it within myself. Because that weed example is very real. Like I started consuming a ton of weed at one point, especially during COVID, because I was like, weed's helped me with depression before. I'm feeling really depressed right now. Maybe if I smoke a ton of weed, it'll help. And it just made it worse, honestly. It just tuned things out to the degree where I was just now confused and depressed. And it wasn't the solution for that. And I've just had to kind of like step back. And so I think, your description of your relationship with prescription pills, kind of, and maybe I don't want to extrapolate, but I mean, how does that sort of, mesh with, your lived experience and your memory of that?
Could you go into a little more detail about what you mean by that, just so I don't misunderstand the question?
Like, I mean, so I started talking about Stanton Peele and his notion of addiction and allowing growth and change in one's relationship with substances or humans, because you were saying that you were leaning too heavily in your mind on these substances for specific instances, and then eventually something changed. I mean, in my mind, if a line of heroin makes your life better every Wednesday when you have to go to church and you feel the spirit that turns you on to religion more because you've done a line of heroin, then you should be able to do the heroin and makes your life better. Keep doing it until it doesn't, right? Like, so why don't you keep taking pills if it wasn't causing you to hurt yourself or hurt your family,
Well, number one, I'm paranoid about permanently damaging my body. When my parents gave me Adderall, I became obsessed with neurotoxicity, and I assumed that I was just going to become. I mean, I was on so much speed as a kid. Well, I didn't stop. I stopped taking it because I knew I was going there again, and I didn't want to tank my testosterone. Also, like I was reading about, I have these kicks I go on. Endocrine system was that week, and I was reading about all these, anecdotal reports and some hard data that points to a permanent reduction in utilized testosterone levels in the bloodstream. And I was sitting there like bugging out, like, oh my God, like I'm never going to be able to have sex again in 5 years. Like I am a huge, like go down the rabbit hole, but I come out of it and I'm serene again. I don't know. It's weird. Like I kind of like doing it. I think I like bugging out. It gives me this mental energy. I don't know. You know, I'm getting too much into my own psychology now.
No, I love it. I love the vulnerability. This is really interesting. I think this is going to interest the listeners as well.
I think so. I think now I've shown up enough that I might, raise an eyebrow or two.
Well, do you want to continue this conversation on tea and other drugs?
Yeah, that actually sounds great. I'd love to connect with you on that. And as soon as you're next week, I'm good. And I don't know if you've got any spare time then, but I would absolutely love to chat with you on your show.
Yeah,
sounds like a cool hang.
Yeah, that's great. And thanks for having me on this. I really appreciate it. I think there should be more people talking about kratom. I think that does a lot to normalize it. And so just thank you for deciding to come into this space. And I hope that you've felt welcomed so far.
Of course. And Soren, thank you. And I welcome you onto my show. And thank you for, I'm not too established yet, but I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come on and give the viewers your story and your information, and very wise beyond your years indeed. You're a prodigious dude, and I know I'm going to see a lot of cool shit from you in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. Well,
of course,
hey, have a great evening, man.